open us up, Rebecca, or?
No? It's your show.
My show. It's Justin's show, but all right, well, welcome everyone tonight to our workshop regarding our stormwater ordinance updates that we're working on. With us today is Chuck Boehm. Chuck is Brown and Caldwell's Client Services Director for Wisconsin. Chuck has over 3 decades of experience supporting clients with advancing their stormwater management programs. During that time, Chuck has worked with over 25 Wisconsin municipalities with many stormwater-related tasks, including stormwater quality plans, watershed studies, planning and implementing construction projects, implementing utilities, updating ordinances, and permit compliance. Chuck has also supported Oshkosh on several projects, including the Regional Detention Basin over by 9th and Washburn, our 2022 Citywide Stormwater Quality Plan update, and of course these code updates that we're talking about here tonight. Chuck has also recently supported the City of Appleton and the Village of Kohler with revisions to their municipal stormwater code to incorporate TMDL pollutant reduction targets in those communities as well. So I think with that, Chuck, I'll turn it over to you for the presentation, and Justin and I will kind of chime in as we go. Certainly want this to be as conversational. Don't feel like you need to hold questions till the end. Just kind of get them out in the air right away so we can hopefully either address them or let you know that we're getting to it. Rather kind of have it that way than try to remember everything at the end, because I know I would personally forget if I had to wait till the end. So,
Yep.
Chuck?
Yeah, totally agree. Want to be a dialogue as much as possible and answer questions. And for the other folks that aren't here with us today as well, of course, too. So thanks for getting together. Kind of going to go around a bit of background, why are we here, what's this whole talk about TMDLs and our permits, things like that, water quality in general. Then we'll talk a little bit about our neighbors. I mentioned a couple of the folks that I worked with recently. I've done some other planning in my career in stormwater utilities and ordinance adjustments, things like that. So we'll look at some of our neighbors, what they've done. And then we'll dive into what are some of the things we've done regarding this particular project and looking at our code updates and how it connects to the citywide plan that James mentioned a second ago as well. And then next steps hopefully would be ultimately to get some concurrence, direction, recommendation from the council to move forward with ordinance updates that everyone feels are appropriate. So again, why are we here? We have a stormwater permit from the DNR they were given the authority through EPA that said, y'all take care of stormwater primarily quality within the state. And so the DNR has issued us a stormwater permit called MS4, and it's both separate storm sewer permit. It's a general permit, which we'll see in a second as well. So there's a lot of other folks that are operating under the same general qualifications or guidance, if you will, requirements of that permit.
Yeah, it all starts with the Clean Water Act.
When you say general permit and you say other people are operating under it, does that mean our neighbors that are also using our wastewater treatment facility?
No, the wastewater treatment facility has its own individual permit.
Okay.
So there are many different classes of permits. The wastewater discharge permit falls under the industrial permitting program, but it still falls under the same WPDES program.
Okay.
But wastewater treatment facilities generally have individual permits that are tailored specifically to the conditions at that facility. General permits are more broad that everybody across the state can generally meet. Some examples of some general permits beside the municipal separate storm sewer permit. There are a lot of wetland and waterway permits that if your impacts are minimal, you can apply and qualify for a general permit, and those are a much easier process. It's usually for general permits for the waterway program, usually a 30-day review period, whereas individual permits are usually more like 90 to 120 days and involve a lot more public involvement and public, not necessarily hearings, but an involvement period. So yeah, the wastewater permit is very different from what we're talking about with the stormwater program.
But for the MS4 permit that we're talking about today, when you say general permit, you mean that we're meeting just general requirements, not that other people are operating under our permit?
No, everybody, all the municipalities, except maybe 1 or 2 in the state, have the same permit requirements and the same permit that they have to comply with.
Okay. I guess my question is, if someone else violates the permit, we don't lose out.
Oh, no,
Correct.
right.
Okay,
Yeah,
correct.
yeah.
Correct.
Yep. So individual communities are named, that you are covered in this permit, so we all have very similar requirements. There are a couple of minor details, particularly with like the TMDL that we're talking about today, because some areas across the state are covered under different TMDL requirements. So we're throwing a lot of verbiage out there too, but we'll certainly want to dive into what that all means and make sure you walk away with a good understanding of that.
Yeah, so for example, if, say, the city of Madison were to violate their permit, that doesn't come back towards us. That is just something they have to deal with the DNR with.
Yeah.
But they're operating under the same permit, the same language in the permit that we are.
Yeah, and I think I'm more concerned. My question really went to like town of Oshkosh and Winneconne that are right on the same. They have the same requirements that we have because we're in the same watershed. Is that right?
Yeah, we'll probably share watersheds
Okay.
for sure. Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yep, and they may have the same targets, reductions, but we're not responsible for them implementing their reductions, and they're not responsible for us.
But we'd have the same TMDL for the waterways, right? Because they're set by
Yep.
Yes.
waters.
Right.
Got it.
Yeah,
Correct.
another perfect example, the university is covered under the same permit as the city is.
Okay.
It's the same rules, the same, all the same language in the permit. There are some things that as a city, we work cooperatively with the university on. For example, some of our pollutant reductions and some of those things, they don't have the infrastructure or the ability to do some of those things. So we've covered that under our permit, and we work with them on a lot of the practices that they do on the campus, and we share that information back and forth. Brad and I've had a lot of conversations about that, especially recently with the TMDL.
Got it. Do we do that with the county too, just because you started talking? But I'm also I'm appointed by the governor at the Land and Water Conservation Board. So do we work with the county conservationist on their TMDL targets? Or do we operate completely separately?
Generally going to be separately. There may be some places where there are some things that we can work together on, but not as much as like the university, which exists kind of within our boundaries.
Okay.
There are some things where maybe with county highway where we are overlapping with some things, there would be opportunities where we would talk about things with them, and it goes along with some of the other handshake trades that we've had with the county, for example. We get out to the periphery where part of our road is maybe in the city, part of it's in the town. The county does the plowing in the winter for the towns, so we get together with the county and say, okay, we'll plow these roads, you plow those roads, and so we do a lot of cooperation that way.
Okay. That's helpful. Thanks.
Yep. And we'll hear more, but so the DNR has given us a permit, and part of that permit says you comply with this TMDL, and TMDL is basically a water quality plan to make the water better, cleaner, etc. So we'll hear more about some of what does that mean, the metrics and what have you in a minute. And so we'll talk through, what is the particular project we've been working on here, and then ultimately we're looking to get some input. I know we can't make a decision necessarily today with the folks that are here, but collectively at a future date we'll look to kind of get some guidance, make sure we're on the right track for the changes we are looking to make. So yeah, we are here to talk about Chapter 14, looking at pollution, stormwater quality aspect of pollution. There's flooding, there's the quality aspects. We're here really talking about the quality piece. We did get a grant, so if anyone's been around long enough, we had gotten a grant from DNR back in 23 was applied, and then contract was ultimately approved by the council in 24 to basically do this project. And so 23, 24 is essentially the years 24, 25 are the years that we're looking to actually provide this study, and so end of the year would be our end date for the current grant period rather.
So that's the DNR Urban Non-Point Source Grant Program. They alternate. One year they'll do planning level grants, the next year they do construction grants. So this, is a planning level grant. It's not building anything. We have also gotten construction funding from that program in the past as well.
Yeah, we had a lot of success actually with getting grants throughout the years, which is great. Lowers our cost overall. So we are aware that flooding is a big driver of why we have an ordinance in the first place. And there's been a number of incidents that have caused concerns and have driven us to create that ordinance. So we're in this go around, in this particular project, we're not looking at modifying any peak flow requirements. There may be some minor language changes to make the ordinance itself more usable potentially in that area, but the bulk of this project is really focused on stormwater quality adjustments potentially and the TMDL numbers, particularly for pollutant reductions. There was a handout too that came with a number of definitions and some other pieces of information, so I won't read through all these things, but kind of some of the lingo that goes with it, acronyms and kind of definitions that we're going to be talking about. If you have any questions along the way, please don't hesitate to let me know. We've been throwing some of these around already. And the two pollutants that we're really focused on is total suspended solids, or the dirt, the sediment that's in the water, and then total phosphorus, which is the nutrient of concern that is driving algal blooms and things like that. So there are other things that go along with those, there's different nutrients and what have you, but those are the two that are measured and monitored, and in the TMDL we are required to track, model, and ultimately comply with and show some reductions towards. Some other permits around the state have, say, bacteria as a TMDL concern. There may be other things coming in the future, but as of right now, the TMDL document we're working with is total phosphorus and total suspended solids. So a little quick background, alluded to this already. We have the MS4 permit. It's issued on the 5-year cycle. So our first one was in 2007, our latest was 2019. This particular version is technically expired by the date, but we are offered and granted and told to continue. So basically we're operating on continuance of that until they make updates. So DNR right now is working on updates to this particular permit, and some of that will include incorporating specific metrics of the latest TMDL, which is the TMDL we're covered under, which is the Upper Fox Wolf watershed, which we'll talk about again. That permit was actually, that TMDL was actually developed by DNR. In the past, they would contract out with a lot of their prior TMDLs, but this one was actually done internally, following the same guidance, same modeling, et cetera, that they have done in the past. So our charge as an MS4 covered under this permit is to show continued progress towards meeting those TMDL reductions. We're not, we're going to see some numbers in a little while, and we're not going to be required to meet those numbers tomorrow or 5 years or 10 years or maybe even 50 years. We'll see. It's kind of debatable as to what it looks like. So we have no hard and fast date under a current permit that says thou shalt meet these reductions by X date.
Which is very different from other permits. For example, our wastewater permit, we've got to meet it by our next permit term. So we were given basically a permit term, which is 5 years to come into compliance. What the DNR has done with some of the previous TMDLs as they've updated the permit is they included language that within 10 permit terms, you had to come into compliance from a stormwater side of things. So they've looked at very different compliance schedules on the stormwater side versus the industrial side, and as it pertains to us, the wastewater treatment plant.
That was one of my broad questions here.
Yep.
So, and we'll get into it. If it's for later with the numbers, just tell me it's for later with the numbers.
Okay.
Are there ever specific requirements with this?
Yes, there are very
there are
specific.
numeric targets that we're going to be striving towards, correct.
But striving towards is a lot different than making progress towards, because it reads as if we need to keep doing this. I kept looking back at the memo from Mark the last time this came up in 2022, and his memo from the city manager's office was, we keep making progress, but there's likelihood that we're never going to be required to do anything at all in 50 years. And that technology will evolve in those 50 years to make this easier as we go.
That is part of the big struggle is, especially from a stormwater standpoint right now, the technology, if it exists, is extraordinarily costly from a stormwater side, whereas it's a little less burdensome on the industrial and the wastewater side. So like Chuck said, we don't know what this next permit is going to say, but past permits have said you need to show continual progress towards meeting that requirement in each permit. So, if one permit cycle you say, okay, we're at, I'm just going to make up a number here, 20% removal, they're going to expect your next one is going to be larger than that.
I get that. When it reads make progress towards and expect that, are we ever held accountable to that ever? Because it reads from Mark's memo that we are never going to be held accountable.
At this point in time, we do not know how they will ultimately do that.
And I get that it's a permit, I get that there are rules, I get that there's a reason for this, I get that there are metrics, but I spent a long time reading the whole thing, and I'm a layman here, you are experts on this, and you are experts on it, more so than I, but the part I just don't understand is that making progress towards
So
I'll important later.
So two quick things. One is because industrial permit or a wastewater permit is really a point where they can really manage their entire water process very uniquely and distinctly. They're a little more aggressive on those permittees because they can see and they have technologies now. They're not all cheap, but they have technologies. In a stormwater world, we're so dispersed. There's so many different outfalls in so many different directions. For us to manage the volume of water and in the different directions that it's flowing to is very challenging. So there's a recognition that we're just in a whole different ballgame. But to answer your question about reduction, so yeah, we will have metrics there will be target reductions or target levels to meet that will be in our permit. And in the current permit, even it says, if you are in a TMDL community, we expect you to show this level of progress on this permit. So 10%, 5%, whatever that, based on the two different pollutants we're talking about. So there is actually like kind of a prescription, if you will,
Yep.
of if you're at 2 pounds today, you need to get 10% off tomorrow.
Yep.
By the
I
time
saw
this
all that.
goes.
I
So,
get- I get it.
So, yep. So definitely we have to kind of show progress. And yeah, the DNR has levers to force things to happen or fine us if we don't comply. I have seen that happen on a erosion control setting, not so much on the quantity reduction world we're in right now, but I would venture to guess that will happen at some point in time if people are seriously not making an effort.
But you're always measured against yourself, right? So the reduction is a 5% against where you were before.
Correct, right.
Okay.
It's you versus the pollution.
And there's no, as far as I could tell in Regan, there's no recourse built into any of this. It's not a recommendation, it's stronger than a recommendation, but there's no,
Yeah. What
there are no
happens?
penalties or fines.
What happens if we violate our permit?
Right, that's what I'm saying. I couldn't find that language in any of the things we're talking about.
Violations of the permit, I'm
I don't recall what the.
I
penalties
don't
are,
know
but-
exactly what it is, but certainly there are, penalty clauses built into the permit.
I would hope.
Could be fines, could be, administrative orders. They have a variety of different enforcement mechanisms. From my standpoint, operating this program and overseeing the operation of this program, the last thing I want is something like an administrative order where the department comes in and says, this is how you're going to do it. Because they don't know the particulars of how our community functions.
And it would probably be a lot more expensive.
Yep.
Yes.
So yeah, I'll digress for now, but that's kind of where I
Yep.
struggle from the concept is, I get what it is, I get why it is, but I don't understand the functionality of it, especially after we got that report from 2022 and Roloff said, we can just leave this alone for 50 years and maybe nothing happens. So maybe that's bad advice, but that's why I was looking so much for that document that was missing, so keep going.
Okay. No, I appreciate the questions though. So moving on, so our Chapter 14 is the code that guides us. Again, the stormwater flooding was the driving force behind the original ordinance that was created in the 1990s, and then we had a major revision in 2012 when we had changed the ordinance number and then also incorporated the stormwater quality. That was the same time the DNR had basically promulgated their NR 151s and 216s, and we basically the permits were being rolled out, guidance, the requirements for how we're going to try to meet stormwater quality. Those all were happening around the same general time frame. Now,
In that update in 2012 too, that was, some of that work got accelerated a little bit due to an audit from the EPA. There were a few things we were a little behind on, and so that audit kind of sped up that code update to get fully in compliance with the permit at that time.
audits are no fun. So again, talking about Chapter 14, our pollution control requirements currently are 40% reduction in total suspended solids for redevelopment and an 80% reduction in total suspended solids for new development. It mirrors the NR 151 requirements and the basic initial ask of DNR before TMDLs were created. The thinking around that was, let's put something in place that we're going to be able to start to get to addressing the whole water quality problem. And at the time, they weren't sure. And then again, every watershed is unique, every situation is unique. But they wanted to put in place and codify some reductions that everyone's going to be held to. And now that these TMDLs are in place, now we have a better idea of what the health of the water might need to be. So we'll see some of those metrics in a few minutes. And our permit requires sites that have a pervious area of 20,000 feet and greater.
Or an acre of disturbance.
Or an acre of disturbed area.
When I was looking through this before, I guess what I don't understand is how we measure that. So if it's a new
Sure.
development, we're talking about Pioneer Island, for example, just to use it. There's a lot of grass there.
Yeah.
How do we determine if there's an 80% reduction? Where's the measurement? Who measures it? And then when do we follow up to see if there's been 80% reduction in TSS?
Yeah.
It's all based on modeling from their site plans.
Okay.
So it's not something that can really easily be physically measured out in the field. So there are a couple of different stormwater models, Windsland being the most popular in the state of Wisconsin. The DNR is very heavily involved in how that model calculates the reductions from various stormwater practices. So for example, the parking lots right out here in front of City Hall, there's a couple of large stormwater practices, the biofilters. That's not counting the big underground system in the parking lot, but there are a lot of biofilters. Those were installed to reduce the total suspended solids generated from the parking lot as we redeveloped it. So that project needed to meet the 40% reduction, but it's all versus a no controls based on the model. So you model your development as if you had no practices in place, and it gives you, for example, it would say this development with no practices in place generates 100 pounds per year of total suspended solids. If it's a new development, it needs to remove 80 of those. If it's a redevelopment, it needs to remove 40 of those. So it's not something that is specifically monitored and measured. It is all based upon the modeling that's done during site plan development, and that is one of the big things that our engineering division staff are reviewing during site plan review, is that stormwater quality modeling in addition to the peak flow control modeling.
So that's super helpful, but so a lot of this is theoretical.
Yes, it's
And on a page.
almost all of it, I would say, is
Okay. And so undeveloped land, for example, we're saying contributes the most to our issues.
The most delta change, probably,
Does that,
at least in theory.
I see how that's not true. So I guess maybe that's, I just want to make sure I'm understanding that right. The modeling would show undeveloped land is contributing the most.
It's measured from the developed condition though. So that piece of land that is 3 acres, when
Yeah.
it turns into a CVS or whatever, some sort of business, that is then the base condition is like if you built that CVS and you didn't treat that CVS. So it's not based on the
Got it.
3 acres of grass space. Now there's plenty of sediment that comes off grass and nutrients
Yeah.
for that standpoint. But they look at it, if you built it without any controls, that's kind of the starting point. And then you remove 80% off of that. You don't take 80% off of the 3 acres of grass because that's just
And
a
there's a-
monumental challenge there.
and
That's
there's a
very
different
helpful.
set of practices and requirements for agricultural land.
Sure.
They don't operate under the same permit requirements that we do.
Correct.
And
Do you have
then we
requirements?
get the benefit of all of their phosphorus in our water when we're testing it down here. Is that okay? Just want to make sure I understand. The looks say that I understand it correctly.
It's a holistic approach to water quality, though.
Got it.
But that also is a part of one of the strategies for complying with TMDLs, especially from point sources, is pollutant trading and adaptive management. So point source can work with an agricultural discharger to put practices in place to reduce in this case, typically phosphorus, reduce the load coming off of that agricultural field to meet their requirements. And that is a whole different, set of challenges and a lot of different rules. How far away is that practice from where your discharge is? And, we actually explored that quite in depth as a compliance strategy for the wastewater treatment plant.
And that's helpful, and that's the reason I'm being facetious. Obviously, when I'm talking about the phosphorus, but I ask because what we do in the Land and Water Commission is truly look at county conservation plans, which works with farmers to do things like ground covers,
Yes.
and other issues. And so that's where my question originally came from: with are we working with our county partners on similar issues? Because really, when we're looking at our permit, I hear you. We have to make sure we're complying with our permit. When we're thinking about whether or not the water that surrounds us and flows through the middle of our city is clean, we can't do that alone. So that's why I'm asking the question.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, so that thank you, DJ. That
Yeah.
gives me a little more context. So, for example, I do have some fairly regular conversations with the Winnebago County Land and Water. Right now, as a part of our wastewater treatment plant interim compliance, we are paying into the multi-discharger variance program, and then county land and water conservation departments can use that money to help those agricultural dischargers implement those kinds of practices to reduce the overall impact to the water body. So that is how some of that is working right now.
Yeah, that's great. That means we're helping.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great.
So, because that's a great kind of leading question to like this graphic and this statement about the watersheds we're talking about. So the Upper Fox and Wolf watersheds, massive land area. We're just a little teeny piece on the west shore of Lake Winnebago. But that plan was developed similar to how we just talked about site plan development using models to estimate loads from all different types of sources, and then looking at what sort of reductions might be needed to come to a level that they felt allow the streams and the lakes to be healthy. And they use different models and what have you. That does include us as urban communities, as well as industrial discharges and wastewater treatment plants, and of course agricultural communities. So they all have differing targets. We talked about, we have targets for our watersheds as a municipality. Other municipalities in the same watersheds or reach sheds would have the same targets we do. So it isn't because you're in that left side of the watershed and you're on the right side, we're gonna tell you to do 55 and you're gonna do 35, It's like if we're in the same watershed, stream drainage area, municipalities are asked to do the same reductions. Everyone built out differently, right, wrong, or otherwise. That's kind of the approach that they've taken. And then industrial wastewater have their own permits that they're driven under. Agriculture is a little bit of a different beast, but they are also included here, and there are expected reductions from those sources ultimately. How it gets to that, not necessarily it'll be our problem. It's our concern, but it's not ours to deal with, I guess.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yep. And so here we are in the kind of that west lake shore of Lake Winnebago, and we have 4 different, we could call them reach sheds, watersheds, drainage areas. They're all kind of essentially the same thing. It's like the water that drains through and with a single water body in mind. So we have the Fox River itself, that little skinny piece between Lake Beatemore and Lake Winnebago. Lake Winnebago has a set of targets. Lake Beatemore has targets. Sawyer Creek, that blue area that kind of goes through southwest and northeast, has targets as well. So again, those extend well beyond our boundaries, so other municipalities would have the same reductions that we'll see in a minute as well. We do, as we also mentioned, have wastewater plant limits as well. It's different from our numbers. So these are the numbers in all their glory. That's just the cover of the plan that was adopted by DNR in 2020. So you'll notice the top 4 of the different TMDL reaches we were just talking about. So you have Sawyer Creek, the 3, Lake Beatemore, Fox River, and Lake Winnebago. Those 3 in the center all have the same total suspended solids reductions. There's the way that they are, the amount of sediment needed to be removed from them is a little bit different in how Sawyer Creek operates, and whether they looked at different loads. And they did do sampling. So when they did these plans, they did take samples. They looked at bugs and bunnies, if you will, the waterways. So someone brought up the point, what'll happen in 30 years, 50 years, or whatever. They will take additional samples. They will look at the health of the waterways. At some point in time, they may have to modify the plans potentially, but we just don't know. But that's part of our ask, is to make that progress, and hopefully we'll start to see the water quality improve, and maybe down the road we'll be able to say we've done enough and the water's healthy. Staying with the TSS on the left-hand side, we didn't really talk about the Nina Slough, which kind of was almost a surprise to us. The lower Fox River TMDL was developed before the upper Fox Wolf TMDL was developed, and lo and behold, when they finally got to doing this watershed, they found there's a very small area up in the fairgrounds on the far north part of the city that's actually part of the Nina Slough. It's currently undeveloped, it's county land. We're not overly concerned with that because it is undeveloped, and basically because of those numbers we were talking about before, 80% reductions that'll happen, and then the phosphorus that'll go with it, it'll basically develop its way into compliance with these numbers. So not really concerned with that. It'll show up on a couple slides, but it's not an area we're terribly concerned with. Shifting to the right-hand side of the column, the requirements of the TMDL, what they found need to be done for the waterways to be healthy is a different story. The numbers are all the same for Sawyer Creek, Lake Beatemore, Fox River, Lake Winnebago, and they're very, I would say, aggressive numbers. 85.6% is a significant number to talk about reducing it. For a couple of reasons. One is because, again, on a water quality perspective, for stormwater, we have all these different sources and all these different discharge points, so it's just a broad brush of areas we would need to look at and consider and ultimately manage to some degree or another. And phosphorus, think about dirt and stuff, you look at that and throw it in the water, it just kind of settles out to a degree. Maybe some of it stays a little longer, it takes a while to settle. The difference between nutrients and phosphorus in particular, like nitrogen, there is a dissolved portion. So there's a part of that just stays in the water column and doesn't settle out very well. So when we see some of the different stormwater practices and talk about, what can we do to get this out of the water, phosphorus and nutrients in general are just a little tougher because there's certainly some of it that is particulate, that clings to solids even, that'll settle out, but a number of that, a good portion of that will just stay in the water column and go right through a lot of the practices. So nutrients are just a little harder to get out. And so when you take that into mind and you look at the magnitude of the number they're asking us to reach, from a technological perspective, that's an extremely challenging number. You're basically talking wastewater treatment plant type of reductions. It is, call it what it is. It's going to be a very challenging number. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do things to maybe continue to make progress towards that number, but I mean, realistically, it's going to be a long time before we can meet that number. Any questions on the numbers? So we've got a variety of targets we're looking at. Okay, so talk about the citywide plan in 2022 that was developed for the city. We looked at the TMDL reductions that were put in place in 2020. We looked at then where do we stand with TSS and TP from a current level with the different ponds that are in place in the city, the different various types of stormwater practices that are in place, the street cleaning and the catch basins, all those different practices. So we are looking at ourselves in the same level. We talked about a development that like builds up there and they've got 100 pounds of whatever, and then they have to get down to 20. We look at ourselves the same way. We have all these different land uses and soils that produce pollution, and we use a model citywide that said with all those land areas and soil conditions, what have you, we had a starting point as well at what does the city look like, and then we get to remove pollution with all the different practices that we have in place. And so when you look at the left-hand side, it says TSS load reduction. That's a requirement we're asked to get to. The next column over is where are we today, technically 2 years ago, based on the citywide plan. So the good news is for those three in the middle, TSS, we're pretty able to get to that number without a lot of effort because we had been working already for a while with stormwater quality. We're now just measuring ourselves to a different set of criteria. So TSS for those three.
And part of that too, some of the original stormwater MS4 permits had a citywide TSS reduction goal of 20% by 2008. 2008, and then originally there was a 40% by 2013. The legislature later removed that 40% number, but you still had to, you couldn't go backwards from where you were. So from a citywide standpoint, we had been working towards getting beyond that 20% number, starting with the very first permit that we had. So that's why, as you look at those current control numbers, they're all above 20% because that's where we had already been working towards.
Yep, great point. We're doing okay in Sawyer Creek, but we're only about halfway there. Every watershed, every municipality is different in how they're built out, how long ago we were built out. So like some of the more dense urban older areas are just going to be, there's more pollution there because we haven't gotten practices in place because it just wasn't the mindset to do back in the day. So as we look forward, and that's why the ask on new development is what it is, to put those in place now as you're building rather than having us to chase that down the road in the future because it just gets that much more challenging.
Sorry, when you say development, I probably should have asked this earlier.
Sure.
Do you mean things like street reconstruction? Would that count as new development?
It can.
That would generally count as redevelopment.
Okay. And that has a lower standard,
Yes.
we know. So when we look at, if you think about Sawyer Creek, that's so residential all around Sawyer Creek that it's unlikely we're going to have a bunch of CVSs, to use your example from earlier, just built around it so we can redo it. So are we looking at a city when we do street reconstruction at improving these numbers for Sawyer Creek in particular?
Yeah, we're looking at the practices that we're doing as a part of street reconstruction projects, and then we're also looking at where are good locations to put regional larger facilities.
Okay.
From a watershed standpoint, it is better for the overall watershed to really try to manage it in a couple of regional larger facilities if you can, rather than a ton of small little bitty ones. That being said, residential properties, things like rain gardens, rain barrels, and practices like that are great on the ground practices because they stop that runoff. So those are great practices. But once your pollution is in a storm sewer system, you're looking more at trying to do a larger regional than a lot of little small things.
Got it. That's helpful.
How do we get people from stop putting down phosphorus fertilizer on their lawns, which is ultimately just going to run into Sawyer Creek?
I believe there's been a statewide restriction on that already.
I think that's correct, right?
I think it's limited to only new lawns, if I remember the state requirements correctly. So there have been some things done at the state level to make gains in that regard.
When you say new lawns, what do you mean?
I believe there may be some exceptions for, if somebody is, they built a new house and they're trying to get their lawn to establish. I think there might be some exceptions to the phosphorus restrictions in fertilizer for those, but it's very hard to get because statewide it's, there are those restrictions in place. I personally haven't gone looking for fertilizer because I don't put any on my lawn.
Sure.
I don't fertilize my lawn, I don't water my lawn, and
Yeah.
I hope I don't have to mow it for July and August.
I was just gonna kind of add it. Yeah. So I built a house, or bought a house new, almost 15 years ago now. And even back then, it was very hard to find any type of fertilizers that had phosphorus in it. So it's out there, but I know there it is very selective in trying to even obtain it.
Okay.
Yeah, great discussion. So on the right-hand side of the table is where are we with that phosphorus number? And again, we talked about the challenge with meeting those rather high levels. And as we talked to with that dissolved portion of phosphorus, we're going to generally be lagging the TSS numbers. So to see those numbers lower is very reasonable based on what we see in the industry because of that dissolved portion. And you can see we've got a decent ways to go. Again, not that we shouldn't continue to kind of make progress toward those numbers and when we asked to by our permit. But I think DNR also recognizes that that is a big ask, and technologically it's just a challenge. There are techniques out there. You can add coagulants to stormwater ponds and settle out to those levels, but it's expensive. And again, we are dealing with a very dispersed area. So even if you did that, which we maybe someday will on some key facilities, you're talking about putting in mechanical equipment. How do you remove that when that flock settles out? Continually kind of maintaining that recharge of that. So it's not without cost, and certainly so technologically there may be some things that can do those numbers, but it's expensive, and in a municipal base, it's not very practical. There's a friendliness at the bottom. We're really nowhere there, and again, I'm not really worried about it, but we'll keep tracking it down the road as we develop in the city. So our citywide plan, did look at total suspended solids, total phosphorus. We looked at some practices, so as discussed, what about, what do we do in Sawyer Creek? And we did look at around the city for opportunities to enhance current practices, build new practices, and part of our plan collectively, and the ask by the DNR is to do a structural practice in your 5-year permit term as well. So what that is, they don't tell us. It could be, a monstrous detention pond, it could be something smaller, it's kind of up to us, but we are asked to do that as well. So we looked at different types of practices. We talked about the enhanced settling, which is a coagulant-based sort of a thing. And we also considered what if we looked at different requirements for new development and redevelopment. So that was part of our citywide plan. So if you look at the left-hand side, the different revision to Chapter 14 in the development of that plan, we looked at what might happen in the next 30 years if development stayed the same as it had been in the prior years when we were kind of building this sort of plan, and what's the mix of new development and redevelopment, and there's a mixed development category in there as well. We looked at a couple of different types of scenarios for increasing either total suspended solids and or total phosphorus, and we looked at a few different specific on-the-ground sites in the city and said what would happen if we implemented these reduction targets, and we'll see a lot more about that as well coming up. And we did also add an implementation plan aspect to do this particular project, which is let's look at specific potential changes to our ordinance and what are we comfortable with that we feel makes sense for us as a municipality. So now we're down to our scope of work. What were the nuts and bolts of what we were being asked to do today? Do you have anything you want to add?
Nope.
Okay. So we did look at some other municipalities around us, peer communities, neighboring areas, what are they doing across the state and close by. We've got some numbers to share that. I mentioned we looked at two scenarios of potential reduction changes, requirement changes, and 3 sites. So we modified that. We had actually 3 more scenarios that we evaluated, and then 2 more new development and redevelopment site that we'll see in a minute. So we wanted to then look at how do those play with the potential reduction changes or target changes. And then we want to make sure we're communicating with stakeholders, this being kind of the first stakeholder group besides staff, the closer municipal staff, making sure that you all are comfortable with where we're going with this, and then we'll take this to a couple other groups as well. We talked a lot about this already, the state code 141 and the 48%. So I don't know if you have any questions on that. We did want to kind of see what our neighbors were doing. So we're curious, right? And I've done this in the past. So looking at peer communities, neighbor communities, the left-hand side are those that we found that were implementing essentially some sort of TMDL reduction. They were above or beyond or changed from the 40 to 80%. So the communities on the right are still sticking with those 151, 40 and 80% numbers. The ones on the left are looking at a change to more of a TMDL directed number. And we'll see some of those metrics in a second. I did want to note that two of the communities that we looked at that I would call kind of peer-ish communities, La Crosse and Eau Claire. La Crosse does not have a TMDL currently in the area right now, so they are without any TMDL additions. And Eau Claire just has a lake within the boundaries that has a TMDL, so they don't have that blanket of TMDL coverage like we do here in Oshkosh, like Appleton does and other communities do that we would also might consider peer communities. So we saw a very solid mix of some that were kind of status quo for one reason or another, and others that had changed their targets to meet essentially TMDL numbers.
One thing I just want to note, kind of on the left side, the local ordinances that have already had changes, I think the majority, if not all of them, are in the Lower Fox TMDL, which was approved prior to the Upper Fox Wolf, which we're in. So that's why I think a lot of those communities have already changed their.
That was the first one in the state, I believe, too, wasn't
I
it?
thought
Or
it
did
was-
Rock, or did Rock beat?
Rock
come
would
up
have been first, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they've already made the changes to their code to start implementing these practices. We're falling a little behind them because our TMDL wasn't implemented as soon as theirs was.
Right, and you'll see, and actually I'll share some of those numbers here now, and you'll see kind of some of that in this story, basically. So Appleton, the majority of their waterways were Lower Fox. You know, we did an update with Appleton a couple years ago, about the same time we did this for Oshkosh. The decision was made there to basically take the greater of the two numbers. So if the TMDL controlled, the TMDL number reduction was applied in their ordinance. If the 40 or 80% number, which is in NR 51, was kind of trumped, then they would use that number. We did have the Upper Fox Wolf numbers at the time that citywide plan was done for Appleton, so Lake Winnebago is using those numbers. So you'll see the total phosphorus are the 85.6% reduction numbers. Again, we talked about the aggressive nature of that number, but within our permit and within our ordinance, we are allowed to provide, or if someone comes in and says, I can't meet that, it's not practical, I can't do it technologically, it's costly, whatever, there is what's called a maximum extent practicable clause, or MEP, that some communities like Appleton have been applying in the past on a, I don't want to say regular basis, but they have not been shying away from doing that. So they did not feel putting a higher target up there was a concern for them. We generally have not been liking to apply an MEP, so we hold ourselves to the standards that we ask for, and we hold our developers to those standards. And so that's why we're kind of treading lightly on like what's the right number to use here. We don't want to get at a number that's
And we haven't
aggressive.
had this type of aggressive number in our
Right.
in our ordinance before either. So, you know, the numbers we had were very achievable.
Sure, right,
The numbers that the TMDL was looking at are
are a little more
Or not.
aggressive. Right, yeah. So again, the different communities, Neenah, Menasha, again, kind of a mix. You're seeing essentially they're using in some instances the same mindset of the 41% for TP for redevelopment and total phosphorus for redevelopment. It's essentially the same as the 40-25 of some of those others. So they're following the same sort of methodology. The Neenah didn't update their ordinance as recently maybe, so they don't have phosphorus for the Upper Fox Wolf watershed.
So the state doesn't require these numbers in our ordinance. That's what I'm hearing.
The state requires us to achieve these ultimately, but we're not required to put them in our ordinance today.
And
Correct.
but achieving those numbers, they're achieved in the aggregate based on the modeling of the city.
Right.
Is that right? So developers. So if you look at our TSS numbers, for example, they're ahead of that 20%. So technically, we could have a new developer come in and they would not be meeting these standards, and we would still be as a city above that 20% that the permit requires.
They would still be as an individual. They still as an individual would have to meet the 80 and 40 or 40% reduction based on the type of development.
But I think what you're saying is if a development came in and we wouldn't hold them to the standards of that, we as the aggregate as a whole would still be above our.
We'd be in compliance with
required
our
number.
permit.
The answer, yes. I would say yes.
For the TSS, but remember the phosphorus has got a much higher target. So
Yeah,
with that,
which we're nowhere close to.
right, with that
also.
TSS does come phosphorus, and so we like that.
Yeah.
Granted, it's a little different beast, but
I'm just weighing, I mean, I hear you.
Yeah.
I'm weighing, once we start requiring these things and understand that there's always a back door, I just don't want to make development harder here. I like that development here is easier than Appleton based on what you're telling me right now. So I want to understand what changes we can make that help our permitting process, that make the water cleaner, but also don't give us a disadvantage to the localities that have implemented these tougher standards, because honestly, we might be at an advantage today. So that's the perspective that I'm coming to.
Well, we'll see some of the potential scenarios in a little bit
Yeah.
here too as well, So as part of this project, we were looking at, again, making that progress towards those TMDL numbers. We did have a question, how feasible is this to meet some of these numbers? So we were keeping that in mind, and certainly we did consider costs, specifically with the 2 sites that we did under this current project. We did not look at costs under the citywide plan. We looked at different ways to meet the 2 targets that were evaluated there, and we've expanded that, but we did not actually include costs for the citywide study. So when we talk about cost later, it'll just be for the 2 sites that were done on this current project. But it's always good to know, like, what are we talking about, the impacts potentially. So these are in the handout, and you hopefully had a chance to glance at these. So this is just kind of a synopsis of the different potential scenario changes for phosphorus and total suspended solids for new development and redevelopment that we looked at. So our current code, it's getting at 80 and 40% for TSS for new development, redevelopment. There are no phosphorus reductions currently in our code. Scenarios 1 and 2 are done under the prior citywide plan. And
1, 2, and 3.
No, 1 and 2 are done under the prior plan.
3 is TMDL.
3 and 4 were done under this plan.
Sorry, you're right.
And then 5 is also done now as kind of a mix. But so scenarios 1 and 2. So scenario 1 was looking at a couple of things regarding that real quickly. So the 85% number for new development, what we found actually when looking at some of the different development sites in the city, because we have a flood management component, we have to look at stormwater quantity as well as the quality aspect. A lot of times those sites were actually really close to 85% because they had oversized facilities to deal with the flooding aspects. So we felt maybe 85% for new development isn't much of an ask, and they've got the land to work with. They can kind of work their site plan and their grading and so appropriately. So it's a step up, and it's not a huge step up, and it's something that we've seen others achieve in the city.
And you said many. I think you said many and close to. Many of the developments are close to 85%. How many exceeded? I
was just looking at some of the sites that we were looking at the time. I don't have like
Yeah.
a specific number. So
Okay.
and each site's different. Yeah.
Yeah. I just wouldn't want many to mean the majority are below the standard we're about to set.
Well, and we'll talk about that. So
Okay.
all the sites that we looked at that we're talking that we'll see as examples, we're all meeting the requirements at the time.
No, I know, but I mean the new requirement.
Yeah.
I don't want us to be failing everybody that just developed something that exceeded what we're required to exceed at 80%. It sounds like we did, who would now no longer be meeting it when we really are still in compliance with what the state requires.
Correct,
I'm
and we
just
wouldn't
trying
go back and say you owe me 5%, right?
No, 100%.
So, yeah,
I want to make sure we're encouraging new development.
Understand.
The exact same question, the exact same concern.
And I think you'll see why, as we looked at, additional scenarios through this effort,
Yeah.
you'll see those all hold the same number, the 80% number.
Sure.
Again, recognizing that, well, like Chuck said, a lot of new development would meet the 85, but why go there?
And that's the question that we know these numbers are created by ultimately people that are elected to sit in Madison, like people like us. And Brad's an expert in this. I'm not an expert in this. So 80% seems like a really nice number. 85% seems like a nice number. 90% seems like a nice number. So I guess I just want to understand real impact before we actually curb development.
Yep.
That's really kind of right.
That's great, and I appreciate that. So there is a little bit of method to the madness behind all these. I won't go through them all, but 58.4, you'll see that might ring a bell. That's our Sawyer Creek TMDL target number. So we looked at that as maybe let's ask redevelopment and to try to meet that, to try to encourage us to meet the TMDL for Sawyer Creek sooner than later. For instance, the phosphorus on the right-hand side, the 35%. There's DNR technical standard, and again, talking about like the capabilities of certain practices to meet certain reductions. Some practices, if you implement properly, the maximum you're going to get for phosphorus is 35%. Sure. So why put out something that's going to be really a stretch for someone that might use a practice like that to say, I want 55%, and I know it's just going to be really painful for you, right? So we're trying to kind of look at that balance of practicality, implementability for the two different types of development, the redevelopment and new development. So there's a bit of a story behind all these, like scenario 4, the redevelopment numbers, those are the Fox River TMDL numbers, so.
And one of the handouts that
Yep.
we have is just that, what is, or what are some of the, recognized removal percentages for some of the common stormwater practices? And that's, what Chuck is saying, that's where some of these numbers came from, is looking at what's achievable by today's technology.
Right.
And using that as to help guide us where we think we would like to go.
And because of that, essentially these, and I know we're using percentages here, but essentially this is, and because it's all based on modeling, this is a scorecard that we're creating in a back office and that we then produce to the developer, right? Saying, yeah, you've added these 7 things, so that's going to probably achieve what we're saying.
Well, and they would be modeling their development to show what their achieving as far as removals.
Right, then they have to meet those requirements before they do anything. This is in advance of anything happening.
Well, they don't have to meet them. They just have to theoretically potentially meet them when they install these things.
Well, we're gonna tell them what the things they need
They
to do
they have to show
Right.
with their modeling that
Yeah.
if they construct the practices per their plan, the model says this is what they're achieving.
There's no output, it's in advance. I mean, we're gonna say, these are the things you're going to do to make these things happen, we think,
Right.
and do them.
Yep. And when we're held to the same standard, and we're asking for our record drawings, as built of that, to show that you did build it properly, and if you didn't build it properly, go fix it, type of thing.
Sure.
And,
But nobody measures afterwards, is what you're asking, right? Because there's no way.
Correct.
there's
Actual
no-
numbers don't matter. Theoretical
Correct,
numbers
there's no measurement of any of this
And
before or after.
Right, and honestly, that level of sampling and analysis is a bit of a challenge and a burden. We have cooperated with DNR on doing some of that analysis. For some of the practices that we've had, they have had continuous sampling units, flow pace sampling units. So they put a flow meter in a pipe, and that as it detects flow, it starts taking samples. So you get a composite flow based sample that then they're analyzing what's coming into the practice and what's leaving the practice. So we have been helping the DNR try to try to define what these practices are actually capable of.
Sure.
So that but to expect a development to try to do that, it's just not reasonable.
Oh, 100%. And I'm not arguing that they should. I'm
Right.
just saying we're going to give them a score based on our modeling of their development plan.
They're going to do the
model.
model.
Okay.
They do the model.
Got it.
We set the targets. They do the model
Okay.
and develop the practices and show the model results that get there.
And we don't check their homework.
we do.
We do. That's a part of our
Yep.
site plan
Yeah.
review process.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yep.
That's helpful. Sorry.
Absolutely. No, great question.
It is, because it's a challenge, and there are ways to cheat some of the models, and those are some of the things that we look at as a part of the site plan review. And I shouldn't say it that way. There are inadvertent mistakes. A wet detention basin in the model, you tell the model where the starting water level is. Well, if you don't tell it that it's starting at its normal pool and you tell it it's starting empty, it's going to assume 100% reduction for everything until it gets to that discharge. That's just generally that's a mistake somebody made in putting the model together.
Yeah.
Those are the things that we're evaluating as a part of our site plan review process.
Got it.
Yeah, that's helpful. Good point. Yep. So these are the different scenarios that we'll be seeing in a second on some different sites we looked at. I don't know if there's any other questions about the numbers. We can talk about them more. But
You'll see none of them come close to the 85%
Right, I saw
number.
that.
yeah, we're not a fan of MEP here in the city, so we didn't go there.
We wanted to be realistic.
Right. Correct. So again, we are required every permit term to start making progress towards those TMDL numbers. We, in this prior citywide plan, and we're looking again at this 30-year planning horizon. What does new development do? What does redevelopment do? Well, how far do we get based on past development? The way it currently sits, we're not gonna achieve those numbers in the next 3 years. We're a little challenged with that, and the reason being is because the amount of new development and redevelopment that exists in the city right now is it's not enough to make up for all the existing development that's there. So part of it is just how we're developing. We need more than just that. So that's the additional practices that have to go in place, that the city will have to put in place, and sometime in the future, either retrofitting dry facilities or putting a new wet facility or what have you, or maybe in the future a coagulant facility on whatever pond. That's going to be up to us. So the more that we leave up to ourselves in the future, the more challenging, the more costly it'll be. So this is a summary of the different sites. So we've got a little bit of color coding for the ones that were done under the citywide plan. So the ones that are in purple, if you will, are the prior study. And the two, the Freddy's Oshkosh and Valley Vet, were done under this current project. So the reason to kind of keep them separate is just really from the perspective of we have costs for the two that are from this study. So just keep that in mind. But we did look at a mix of redevelopment sites, new development sites. We want to make sure that we were also looking under this study at two, again, a new development and a redevelopment site, so we can kind of get a sense of what sort of challenge do we have for looking at different practices. And James was just sharing again that there are all different types of practices used. I'll first admit it wasn't exhaustive. We could spend dozens and dozens and dozens of hours looking at each individual site. And quite frankly, each practice that comes up, or each site that comes up in the city, is unique. The geography, the terrain of that site, the intersections, the sewers, all that stuff is unique to a site. So you couldn't spend enough time and money to try to figure this out for every site. So we looked at granted a limited number of conditions and situations, but we wanted to do a little bit of a blend and see what was potentially out there for us. So we did look at different types of practices, expansions of what was on site, new practices. So when we look at those 5 sites, and we'll see that in a second, we looked at a kind of a mix of different practices. You'll also note that, for the biofilter, there's an asterisk there on the TP side. So years ago, a biofilter got some phosphorus reduction credit. As the science evolved, they started to find that, the admixtures to those soils, the plants there living and dying, and they're actually not maybe reducing. They might actually, in some cases, be putting out more phosphorus than the stormwater that's coming into it. So they've currently have not allowed any credit for a biofilter for phosphorus. Now they do have a new filter standard that's being developed and updated at DNR that could potentially change that, but we don't have that currently promulgated or not promulgated, be available as a guidance document. So different practices, as we said, are kind of applicable for different sizes. They get different reductions. They just treat the water, stormwater differently, and some are better at the nutrients than others.
When you're saying biofilter,
Yep.
Is that like a planted swale?
It could be it's like think of a rain garden or or we have biofilters out on the
Right on the parking
here
lot.
outside. So basically,
You've got some of them on the university too.
Yeah,
You've got,
okay.
It's vegetated, it's planted, but it's also got
Engineered.
the engineered
soil,
soil
right.
media and
Underneath
under
it,
drain
right.
and yes.
Yep.
So those were found to be actually releasing phosphorus versus
In some
taking-
In
cases.
some cases, to the point where they did not feel comfortable giving her a credit for that going forward. Again, what was in years ago is what was years ago. So
Interesting.
the science continues to evolve. And going back to the modeling, I meant to say this earlier. I don't want to delay this, but those models were built based on numbers and numbers and numbers of samples that were done, waterway samples, different land uses, different soils, different cities, that built basically a very, very large database, and it's continually being updated and refreshed, of the different impacts of land use soil combinations, practices that can be implemented. And so that model has got science and measurements behind it. We're just not required to measure on a regular basis at this point, just because of the cost, the challenges that James had pointed out.
And that's what I guess I was wondering. I mean, to DJ's point earlier about these numbers being somewhat arbitrary, but like the performance expectation here is built on actual studies that have been done, collecting data, looking at
Correct.
how do these BMPs or SMPs perform.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly right. Yeah, and you use the word BMP, which we used to use best management practice or
Right,
BMP
yeah.
all the time.
They've changed that.
Stormwater management practice, SMPs, is kind of a newer language
Yeah.
changes as well. But you're exactly correct. So the science behind that gives us guidance into what the expectations are for some of these practices.
And that's, so we've been, like I said, we did some sampling. We worked with the DNR and USGS on installing samplers at some of our practices to help add to that database.
Sure. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, but great point. So we have a number of tools in the toolbox, as people like to say, different practices that can be employed. Again, we looked at several of those. I would not say it's exhausted, but I think it's a reasonable look at some of the different things that could be done on some of these sites that we were evaluating. So let's talk about our 5 sites. Again, we've got the 3 redevelopment sites on top and the 2 new development sites on the bottom. These again were all meeting the code at the time that we have in place right now, and they're still meeting the code today. Then we said, what if those practices were in place? How would they fare against these 5 different potential code change scenarios? So across the top is those 5 scenarios that were vertically before. Now we're going left to right, scenario 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And for the different practices, different locations and the practices they have on the ground today, how did their performance match up against what we might consider asking them? And you see it's a real mixed bag. In some cases, yes, they made it just fine. In others, no. Or maybe it's a partial for one pollution or another, pollutant or another, excuse me. Really, again, it's like, it's just a mix of what is the particular scenario asking for? Is it how much of a leap is it from what we have today? The type of practice used, that is it better at phosphorus than not? So it's a bit of a mixed bag. So like the WIT apartments, for 4 out of the 5 scenarios, they would actually meet those reduction targets today if we bumped them up for total suspended solids and total phosphorus. So underneath each scenario are those targets that we had talked about potentially changing our ordinance to read. So scenario 1 for the WIT as a new development site, under scenario 1 we're going to ask for 85% TSS and 57.4% phosphorus. So I said some of these sites are already meeting that. Many of the sites maybe are meeting that. That's a site that is already meeting those requirements. The 80%, it wasn't quite, or sorry, the 90% scenario 2 wasn't quite there. But it was actually meeting phosphorus in that particular situation. That happened to be a wet pond.
So just curious, what are the SMPs being employed at the WIT that's allowing it?
It's a stormwater pond, wet detention pond.
It's a wet detention pond. Okay.
Right. And they tend to carry a pretty high reduction in phosphorus in general. You can design them in many different ways, and it depends on the surface area, the detention time, the size, the elevation, the outlet, the rate which water, so there's a lot of factors, but this particular development would fare just fine under that 85% ask.
Fascinating.
90% wasn't quite there, but again, by the model, it showed the phosphorus actually would have been okay.
But just to be clear, that means we're asking developers to buy land that they have to put a retention pond on that they can't build on.
And in this
Is that
situation, that was the practice they chose to do.
I want to make sure I'm understanding, and I love the planet. I'm asking the hard questions because I just want to make sure we're transparent on what the actual impacts are.
In new development, that's generally going to be the practice of choice.
Okay.
Partially because of our strict quantity flood control requirements.
Okay. Got
I
it.
mean, that's a lot, and that's part of the reason why the WIT, being a new development, use the wet pond, is meeting those because of our strict flood control requirements.
Got it. And those are separate and apart from this. Are they informed by, or do either of them inform
They're
each
separate
other?
from each other, but they play together. Because of the new development strict requirements, they're able to meet the sediment side of things relatively easily because of the wet pond nature.
Are we able to tie, and I'm jumping ahead, so sorry, but are we able to tie the requirements here to where in the city would require a flood mitigation plan, if that makes sense? So are we able to say you have a higher standard because we know that you're going to be in a floodplain? You have to mitigate flooding differently.
We apply that uniformly across the city. We don't apply different peak flow control standards in different watersheds.
Okay. And is that because, and this is going to sound not like how I mean it, but is that because that's easy, or is that because of we're surrounded by water on all sides?
Honestly, when it was initially developed, pretty much every watershed had a problem.
Okay.
So it was, uniformity, while easy, also made sense because of so many issues throughout the entire city.
Okay.
I even look at, something more recent, the 2008 storm events. I mean, 75% of the city was, underwater in that storm event. That's, yes, that's a very, very extreme storm event, but, it's still, there's just that magnitude, and it's because we're surrounded by water.
Yeah.
Off the cuff, I would say 90 to 95% of our storm sewer outfalls are below the normal water elevation of the water body they're discharging to. In some cases, that water elevation backs up 10, 15 blocks into the city. So some of the, you go to the, kind of the north side, the storm sewers that discharge out to, say, Menominee Park, you're back at the railroad tracks.
Yeah.
And you're still seeing the impact of the lake in that storm sewer system, just because we are so flat.
No, that's helpful. And so it doesn't sound like there's going to be a recommendation to change that practice.
We are not recommending
Okay.
changing that as a part of this. This was just focused on the water quality and the TMDL compliance aspects.
Okay.
Right, correct. Great question, though. So, our sites today perform kind of, it's a mixed bag of yeses and nos and partials. Just again, it's depending on the scenario, what were they existing, or sorry, were they new development, redevelopment, what practices did they apply? So it's just kind of the luck of the draw to a degree. There was no engineering to these numbers at the time, right? So it's just how did they fare? So part of this project, which you then look at, and the prior project as well, was to look at, well, if we change those numbers, what could we do on the ground on those sites that could potentially meet the new targets that we might be considering asking them? So the first slide is just a summary of like all the different sites, and then we'll drill down into the two that we looked at under this study with some more specifics, so we can kind of, don't want to try to get 5 of these in front of you because your eyes will probably bug out. But so the big ask was like, are these achievable? Yes or no, using this same typical basket of practices. We're not talking about coagulant additions, we're talking about the same handful of practices that are on that sheet that James held up before. And so we see by and large, the answer is yes. We could achieve these different scenario targets on those sites by changing the practices. And in some instances, we looked at the soils data and realized they weren't actually taking advantage of infiltration that was a few feet below where they built their practice. So, we looked at site-specific conditions. So, not universally, there are still some challenges with what we could potentially ask under any of these scenarios, but technically they could meet these in most cases, not all cases. And the Valley Vet's kind of a little bit of a special. It's a partial TSS and actually TP, which we'll see in a minute here. But so now, is that the right thing to ask? Is kind of like, let's just dive into, we're going to dive into the Freddy's, Oshkosh, and the Valley Vet, at more of a deep dive into like what were the practices we looked at, and ultimately we'll talk about costs, because I know that's always a concern, right? So, Freddy's, Oshkosh, the original site design, it was a redevelopment site, and they basically had 4 catch basins with sumps. So you look at the inlets grates, the water that gets into the system. If it just goes into the pipe directly down the grate and into the pipe, there's no sump. It's just, there's no water quality reduction. There's no settling going on there at all. When you put in a catch basin, which is a couple of 3 feet depending on your what you want or can do, it's basically creates like a mini little detention facility, if you will. It's like this micro stormwater pond. Because there's a standing water, so there's this permanent surface water like we were talking about before with the wet departments. And then there's a little bit of storage, and there's a settling that can happen in there. But they're on a very small scale. So does that site design meet today's ordinance in the left-hand column? Yes, for total suspended solids it does. We didn't have phosphorus, so it was a non-issue. We look at the different scenarios, 1 through 5 across the board there, and we say in most of the situations, that site today would not meet the reductions that we were asking for under the potential code changes. So we happen to have a couple of phosphorus reductions. Again, that's kind of that small wet pool maybe settling out a little bit of that nutrient, that phosphorus, but it's not big enough to settle out a lot of the sediment, and we're not getting a lot of the higher gas. Those are the kind of lowest tiers of the phosphorus reduction. So then we said, well, what can we do differently? What if we took those under alternative 1, made them 10-foot diameter catch basins? Pretty good sized structure, right? Basically expanding that underground wet pool area. How do we do that? Working our way across. Scenario 1, not big enough to meet TSS. It does meet phosphorus now, which it didn't before. Scenario 2, we can get 52%. We're at 54 almost. So we're getting TSS, we're getting TP. Scenario 3, not so much. So again, depending on the practice that we're looking at, as these facilities get larger, you can kind of assume, imagine that it means I'm just getting that better settling product, or maybe the type of practice is different. So like alternative 3 is using permeable pavement, where we're now taking advantage of a subsurface drainage storage volume, but also a filtration and infiltration potentially. So we are able to get water in the ground, and any of the water that goes into the soil below our practice is 100% removable by the DNR the way they look at it. If it goes out a discharge pipe, it's whatever's filtered before it gets out that pipe. So these models have the ability to look at the complexity of what can happen inside these different features.
I know we're gonna talk about cost, but just just being practicality of a permeable pavement area
Yep.
at Freddy's Oshkosh, which is a drive-through, I would imagine that is a more difficult area to keep clean from snow removal.
Yeah, it certainly can be, yeah. Is it the right, again, the question is it the right practice?
But that's the practice for Freddy's that we were able to get across the board yeses. So, again, I just want to be cognizant of the business practicality associated with this.
That's
And
great.
depending
Yeah.
on the permeable pavement system, they're not that difficult to plow. We put a number of permeable pavement systems in our parking lot, our city-owned parking lots as we've reconstructed them. And, we do not have challenges with our equipment plowing them.
I'm sorry. Do you clean them?
Yes, you do.
Because there's a separate machine for that too.
Yes, the best way to clean permeable pavement systems is with a vacuum type of a unit. So again, in our city-owned parking lots, most of them we're using our vacuum assist street sweepers, and get that vacuum head down on the pavement, and then it can remove the stuff that gets stuck in between the blocks.
Which works because we have street sweepers. But as we're thinking about for-profit businesses, they have to be profitable. So that's
That's actually, great point.
And there are
yeah.
there are smaller. I've seen just some walk-behind units that some of the permeable pavement system designers, manufacturers have developed for those types of situations.
And I think as the industry continues to evolve, there are people that go into business to clean stuff like that because there's a need, right? So no doubt about it.
And whether you're buying equipment though or services, you are cutting into your bottom line.
There's a cost, right? Totally agree.
The other, in my day job, I work for a company of massive hotels and water parks, and we have just fields of parking lots.
Yes.
We would not put a permeable pavement area in our fields. I mean, it's acres of parking.
Right.
We would not do it.
Yeah.
And it's because we would never be able to pencil that project to make any money. And so if that's the solution, I know that this scenario, Freddy's, is very different than a Great Wolf Lodge. So I know that we're looking at different things.
Right.
But that means if this was the only solution that we could actually build in Oshkosh, Great Wolf Lodge would not build in Oshkosh.
Yep.
And I'm not the one that decides that, but I can say pretty confidently we wouldn't because we'd never be able to pencil. So
It's not the right practice for that particular site. Exactly true. And we don't have 100% coverage with permeable pavers in our parking lots and in this site either necessarily. So you can do a certain amount of run-on into those porous pavement areas. So you can have drive lanes that aren't paved, and then you basically are parking in these
they're paved.
pavers
They're just
or-
not paved with permeable
Unpaved,
pavers.
right, not paved with pavers.
I don't want it to be. If someone is watching this, I just don't want them to say, "Oh, why didn't they pick the one that has all the blue yeses across it?"
Yeah.
Because it's not the right application for every site.
100%. So I just want to clarify.
I appreciate
This
that.
might be the right numbers. These might be the right numbers, and this might be what we go with. But it's not as easy as looking at all the blue yeses.
Yeah, well, and remember across the line is that the values of that particular practice of porous pavement, just because it met all those numbers doesn't mean it's good to go either.
Right.
But yeah, no, I appreciate the sensitivity. Like,
In a lot of cases, those type of practices, permeable pavers, for instance, those are very effective in the redevelopment scenarios versus a new development scenario, because it takes so much more to hit those new development numbers, even from the state level.
yeah. And your point about, snow management, I mean, whether it's permeable pavers, biofilters, we see you can't put them on top of these practices. You got to put the snow someplace else. If you're limited for space, that's a consideration as well, for sure. So, again, for Freddy's, we found different, it looks like scenario 4 was the toughest one to meet. If it was a little more challenging, it's a lot more no's there. Other practices, and meet different scenarios, different levels of success. Excuse me. And we did include sand filters as an option for 4. We looked at a proprietary filter, which you can basically buy a vault with canisters that treat the water basically as it flows through it. There's an annual maintenance plan you can buy and replace those things every year, what have you. So, but each one of these does come at a cost, right? So that's kind of our next slide here. Is that this is all well and good, but what kind of cost components are? So, not again to bog you with too many numbers, but we understand that different costs are important to different people as well. So Thank you very much for pointing that out. Construction cost is one thing, right? So the person that's building that product day one cares about the construction cost, the variability of that construction cost. The folks that are going to maintain that ad infinitum into the future are very concerned with the recurring annual maintenance cost. Those that are holding the paper on that device also may have a particular periodic recurring cost. Maybe you have to clean out a portion of the sand, you have to dredge that wet pond, whatever. So we try to look at the three different kind of cost components, and we're using, we're trying to be very fair with how we're looking at these. So we created a unit pricing. We don't have any idea what the Freddy's paid for their stuff. We just basically said, well, if we're going to put these in today, with the city, pricing guide, what we comfortable it would cost to install these practices. So we're trying to be fair across the board. What's typical maintenance costs, et cetera, et cetera. So on the far right, we also included an annualized cost. So that's like on a 50-year lifespan of doing this, new construction, the periodic inspection and maintenance and their annual maintenance. What does that annualize out to like on a yearly basis? So from us on a citywide perspective, we looked at that in our own practices, the larger regional facilities, and some of these other facilities as well. So that may not have a great resonation with the people that are building these particular sites, but for us it's nice to be able to compare, like if you were to look at all these different costs together, how do they compare on an annualized basis? So we talked about our underground detention, permeous pavement. That's one of our more expensive capital projects, right? The permeable pavers is your point. It has a relatively low annual maintenance cost, but it does have a periodic routine maintenance cost where you have to do the heavier vacuuming. There's a sealing that's required of those paver bricks if you're following manufacturer recommendation for some of the products. Maybe at some point in time you got to remove the block, take out the sediment underneath it, put the material back down after it's washed, replace it. So I mean, it's not. There is a cost and a recurring maintenance cost as well. So it did a great job, hit all the yeses, but it's also a costly practice.
Yeah.
And maybe again for that particular site, it's not a great practice. Now I will say though, this dawned on me as I was looking at these numbers the other day. This is like an all-in cost, so it's like if I had to build it with that practice today, it didn't deduct the cost of the pavement that they would have had to put in the first place. So there is actually a deduction that probably would take place for that particular practice. We looked at that in say Wauwatosa when they were looking at their alleys program. It's like, well, I've got to put asphalt there. What's the cost difference, the delta? This is actual complete reconstruction and new construction. It's not there's no delta incurred. So it's probably slightly higher than it really would be in reality because you're going to put some pavement down in the first place. So recognizing that there's variability to the practices, there's variability to the different cost components. There are a couple of practices that are not too far off. The capital costs of alternative 4, alternative 5, not too different. Maintenance costs, they vary a little bit. The annualized costs, if you were to kind of gravitate to that, they're all more expensive. Certainly some are much more expensive and some are, again, if you're paying the ticket, I don't want to pay any of it, but there's a incremental increase to that cost, so recognizing that. We did include a 4% interest rate, and we're looking at that 50-year lifespan for all those that like numbers. Any questions on Freddy's? All right, so we did also look at Valley Vet. There are fewer alternatives here. They basically had a pretty decent practice in place, footprint-wise, so it wasn't necessarily meeting the mark in a lot of the different scenarios. If we were to challenge it against some of these potential new targets, it's a sand filter that they have a clay liner, so there's no infiltration. So I'm not sure exactly why they put the clay liner in, but they didn't take advantage of infiltration. So one of the things we did is could you allow it to infiltrate? Well, we found a sand seam, essentially a nice soil layer a couple of feet below that, so we could over excavate that existing facility, same footprint, put a little more extra material out, put a little more sand in, and we were able to get meeting several of the metrics. We weren't meeting them all, we were able to meet a number of them. Maybe we would put in a wet detention plate that says biofilter, but it means sand filter. Biofilter and sand filters are a lot of the same components behind them, but if we looked at a wet detention, again, it's a little more variable, so we're not quite meeting the TSS for alternative 2. We do meet the phosphorus. I kind of skipped our alternative 1 for scenario 1. That's when we meet the TSS, but we're slightly short in phosphorus, but we're using the exact same footprint. We're really close to that metric. Maybe we could have enlarged it by a couple feet and actually hit the phosphorus. So again, each site's a little different. We couldn't meet scenario 2 under either of the situations we looked at. Just for this particular site, it was just a big ask for this location. Scenarios 3, 4, and 5, we were able to do just fine with either an enlarged sand filter or a wet facility in place of a sand filter. How do costs compare? They're actually relatively similar, I would say, for the most part. Sand filter, if we were to build it today under some of our unit pricing, $93,000 roughly was the number we came up with. If we overestimated that, we're pulling more material out, we're putting more sand back in, right? So there's a higher capital cost to that, $10,000, 10% give or take. A wet pond might actually have been potentially slightly cheaper, just with all the different putting sand in versus leaving it as a whole, and letting the water build up, et cetera. So I would say very comparable. And you look at the maintenance costs; they're very comparable over time, as far as an annual maintenance cost. And for a sand filter, it might be just taking debris off the top, maybe slightly raking to make sure that you're getting good vegetation growth, whatever if they're vegetating it. Wet pond, again, on an annual basis, it's just inspections. It's very minor details. Now, the non-routine maintenance costs where they separate a little bit. Sand filter, you're going to remove, we assume you're going to remove about half of that material and replace that in a recurring period every 20 years. We oversize our filters, so we said, let's stick with that same 50%. The reality is you probably don't actually need to move that much material out of there. Typically what'll happen is it'll clog in the kind of the surface of that and it won't necessarily get all the way down, so maybe you don't have to remove half of that sand filter. So perhaps our non-routine maintenance cost is a little over exaggerated in that alternative one. And then you look at the wet pond again, it's just, you're going to dredge that periodically. It's not a super large facility. They could probably easily get to that material, pull it out. It actually looks to be on an annualized basis across the board. Doesn't look to be any more expensive. So they potentially could have. Now, is that again the right practice for that site? I don't know. I'm not there on a routine basis. Would you want that wet pond at a valley vet? I don't know. Part of it is just how they want to deal with that site. Do they want a pool of water? May not want that by your elementary school. I'm not sure. So some of it is just the condition of the site, the owner's preferences, etc. So it looks like these are actually not dramatically different in the long run. There are some differences in the maintenance and certainly capital costs. But we could see this site meeting some of our reductions with maybe even a different practice in a couple different ways. Again, they weren't all achievable, so that scenario 2 just wasn't working for us on this site. And we didn't get crazy and let's double it, because again, there's reasonableness. So we didn't do that. So questions on the 2 case studies, I guess, if you will, that we looked at under this current project. We looked at, again, an exhaustive measure. We looked at a variety of different types of practices and try to get a look at cost to be practical.
One of the things we talked about as staff was how this fits in with the parkland dedication and what considerations we need to take into account when you're making the decisions. Because to your point of making this an attractive place to develop, we want these good things to happen, but you have to balance that. So I don't think, my personal opinion is we have to make this decision with knowing that what we're going to do.
Yeah, if you buy 100 acres to develop, 50 of it can't be dedicated to stormwater management, another 25 to parks, leaving you with 25 acres to develop, right?
Right. So just thought I'd put that out there.
That's helpful. And then another 10 because we have to, well, I guess it's included in the...
For flooding.
For flooding.
Yeah. Right, yeah.
Right.
So that's all I had to share. Some other just general takeaways, kind of wrap up is, again, each situation is unique, right? That Freddy's is different from the Valley Vet, which is different from our parking lot. I mean, each site is unique, so we have to be respectful of that. We did see that P-flow reduction requirements can help us achieve some higher targets just because of the ask there. Infiltration, and we've talked about this at our staff meetings a lot. It's like, man, a lot can be done if you just look at your soils, and a lot of times they're really reluctant to do that because there's a cost to it. I have to hire someone out there to either do a test pit and tell me what the clay is, material is, or whatever it is, or do an infiltration test, and it's a cost, and I totally get it. But I think there's a lot of instances where people are missing out on getting some better reduction numbers, and they can do themselves a favor by doing that.
And
It's
having a
little bit of an
smaller
upfront
practice.
cost up front, and then save a lot of money down the road. So it's kind of like a, anyway, get off my soapbox. But there are a lot of different factors that can impact cost, you know, the size of the type of practice, you know, all that sort of thing. If we were to go, say 85.6% in phosphorus, then we're going to ask for maximum extent. People are going to come in and say, I can't do that. And you're going to be like, you're right, you can't. So staff feels this isn't really something we're real comfortable asking. So we're not going that direction. We're trying to provide a reasonable target we feel is achievable. We've got some examples. Again, there may be other examples where it's just not practical, and we might hear those cases. You could probably also come up with a better mousetrap than we did in the study for something slightly different, because there's a lot of smart people out there, and they're going to look at upfront costs. They may or may not look at the recurring costs as closely, but you know, certainly they're going to be smart people that figure it out. So I guess our ask is looking for some direction, ultimately from council. I know we can't necessarily make a decision here today with the smaller body present, but you know, how do you feel about those different scenarios that we put forward? I think we were gravitating towards scenario 3 or scenario 5 personally, but obviously there are other ways to go.
And so you said 3 was just kind of this, like the standard recommended TMDL? Or like that was what's
3
kind of currently proposed?
Yeah, so scenario 3 is the 80% TSS reduction for new development. We were looking at a 58.4% reduction to essentially help us move towards the numbers in our Sawyer Creek watershed. That's our most challenging watershed from a TSS perspective. Scenario 3 then, because that's the one that's challenged with that number, scenario 3 would say, well, let's keep the 40% for TSS on the rest of the city, and deal with like a dichotomy of whether you're in this basin or some other basin in the city. Scenario 5 is essentially let's not look at the difference between Sawyer Creek and other areas. Let's keep it all at 58.4. That does a couple things for us. One is it's a little easier to manage and for a developer to know what side of the line am I. They don't have to worry about what side of the line am I on. But then it also helps us pull up those phosphorus reductions a little bit more. So everywhere in the city, we talked about 85.6, not a great number, right? But if we're asking 58.4, it gets us to here. If we ask for 40%, it only gets us to here. So by universally asking for 58.4, it helps us with that long-term increase in phosphorus reduction that we're after on a citywide basis. The phosphorus reductions are held the same under either scenario or scenario 3. And the 54% for phosphorus, that's that tag along that kind of happened. You saw some pretty good phosphorus reductions with wet detention. So 80% for TSS, a lot of times brings an order of magnitude around 54% for phosphorus, just be how they're typically designed, and especially what we're seeing in the city with our stormwater flood management aspects. Those seem to be very achievable numbers. And then the 30% redevelopment, it's kind of along more lines of how are we doing with technical standards, our ability to get that, from an achievability standpoint, it's a little lighter ask for redevelopment to meet that. It's achievable. There are some practices that they could, like a biofilter right now today, that wouldn't apply. They could do a sand filter, they could do porous pavement. The new tech standard that they're building off of for filters, sand filters, talks about additives. So you can put actually iron filings in there, which can do or iron aggregates, that can do a great job of actually trapping nutrients. And so there are things you can actually add to sand or soil that are also options. So there's ways to get to that.
I think I have no reason to be opposed to the recommendation for scenario 3. I think what'll be helpful for me and maybe the rest of council is if we can see how the developments currently underway would score against these new standards. So like the Butamore project, Sawdust District, if we could just see what are their scores now, and are those, because those are huge developments that are going to change the city in a very positive way. So I'm curious about that. And then the other question I would have, and this would be in the language of the ordinance itself, but what is the exception? Who determines the exception? If we end up with scenario 3 where some of this part of the city is treated differently than other parts, what happens if someone's building on both parts, for example?
Sure.
And so that'll be the details in the actual ordinance that we have to look at. And so I'm just saying it out loud so that everyone here hears and so that Lynn hears, because those are questions that are gonna come later.
Yep.
We had
But-
talked through some of those
Yeah.
things because you don't want any confusion when it's gonna inevitably come up, so you
Yeah,
wanna make sure.
For
it's-
sure, yep.
And really, what are the exceptions and who manages the exceptions? So if it comes before Plan Commission every single time, that's going to be incredibly frustrating for everyone involved.
Me too.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be frustrating. And I know that if Plan Commission's going to be frustrated, everyone's going to be frustrated.
And just the way
Yeah.
the ordinance is written right now, that MEP, that maximum extent practicable, is, the ordinance is defined as, the control authority, which is the Department of Public Works.
Yes.
So that's generally handled administratively at a staff level.
And that's great. I think then my question on the other side, on the process side, I know this isn't in the ordinance, would be, what's the checklist? Like, what's the criteria? Just because, I would never accuse you all of this, but I don't want whoever's in your chairs 20 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 30 years from now, please stay that long, would say,
I'm not going to be there.
would say, you know
I was
what?
around 30.
DJ has that house over there on Bauman Street, and he wants to do this thing, and I can't stand him. So there's no way that I'm going to give him an exception to this rule. That's what I'm worried about, and that's not true with your department. That's true with any portion of government anywhere,
Yeah.
right? And that's what people are concerned with.
Well, I think that's why we, as an organization, have not wanting to go down the path of setting a higher standard. So there isn't that, not saying there is or isn't a bias towards whatever person or development. It takes away the feelings from a staff level. It's, no, there are practices out here that you can meet these requirements. You need to find a way to do it, rather than, you're close, we'll let this one skirt. You got it. No, you're
You can do better.
You need to try something else. That's why I think it
And
takes it
then-
away from that level.
There is also the appeals process in the ordinance. The decision of the control authority, the department, can be appealed to the city manager. The decision of the city manager can be appealed to the common council.
And I think that'll make sense. I think when we roll this out, people don't like change generally, and they hear that we're making standards harder and it's harder for development. That's what people are going to hear.
Yep.
And so I think that communication is going to be important. The appeals process to the city manager and the city council, that doesn't help with the bias issue, because that seat changes as we see, and these seats certainly change as none of us were here a year and a half ago. So I just would want to see the standards, but
We do that now with BSMs and signs, and every time a sign
Yeah.
comes up, we talk about which BSMs met which thing and why, and it's going to be, that debate will never end.
yeah, 100% it won't. So, but I just
And
want to
that
make sure
the
we're
process is
building it that way.
established, we're going to have the same discussion every time.
I think, anyway, my immediate feedback is I have no reason to disagree with scenario number 3 if that's the recommendation. I like that we're treating Sawyer Creek differently than other areas because we have different standards to be under our permit there. And we know that a lot of it's going to be under redevelopment because of how developed it already is. So we can hold people to a different standard because that's prime real estate in a different way than others. That's my thought.
And I'll give you, I have different concerns to a degree. Can we go back to slide 18 for a second? I didn't ask it then, I should have. And Justin, I asked you the question in email, but I don't know for sure if that's the answer I was getting or not. We said we looked at other municipalities and looked at who had made changes to zoning to reflect this, but I didn't see which ones are which ones. Or are these them?
These are some of them,
You said you evaluated 8 of them and half had made changes and half had not.
No, this is the summary of the ones that we looked at, and
Okay.
half had made changes.
Right, so there's 16 up here.
Yeah.
8 have made changes,
In the code.
8 have not.
And the left is have, and the
Correct.
right is not. So
That's
we are currently on the left or the right? Dumb
We are
question.
currently,
right.
we are on the
Currently
right.
on the right.
Because we're only following the broader standards of 80/40 for the
That's
state.
correct.
Perfect.
We're looking to move to the left.
Got it.
With this
So,
update.
and my concerns are similar to the perception part, TJ, that you brought up. And this is the newbie question to a degree. Stormwater rates currently, what are they used for? Well, I pay a whole bunch for them. What are those funds used for right this second? To go way back, I mean, let's start at the beginning, because I'm worried about the perception more than anything else.
They are used for compliance of the permit.
So some of this already, right?
Yeah, some of this, obviously, as we looked at the scenarios that we analyzed and are looking at, recommending are not going to the TMDL
Perfect.
requirements.
That's what I thought. That's
Because
what I'm
there are
asking.
other things that as a municipality as a whole, we
We're
are doing
right?
and having to do.
So my stormwater fees are going to these things already to a degree.
They're,
To some degree.
they're looking at the things, the macro, the
Correct.
citywide
Yeah.
macro level of things that
So-
we are doing.
I'm concerned with the numbers for Freddy's and Valley Vet because some of those are very expensive. As a developer, I wouldn't pay some of those things, or they would deter me from doing work here already. But what does deter people right now is and correct me if I'm wrong, this is where the number I was looking for that I sent you, we have the highest stormwater rates in the state of Wisconsin today. From everything I've found. And it's not by a little, it's by 60 and 70% in most cases. We have the highest rates here already. So I have a really hard time as a business owner who has parking lots and pays lots of these already, looking at making it even more prohibitive and expensive to get development here. And it's a horse apiece, right? Because we need to do the important things for the sake of the important things, and we'll all have nothing if this doesn't work, but we'll all have nothing if we make it impossible for people to come here and have businesses also. So I mean, it's going to be epic proportions because the Chamber of Commerce asks every candidate every cycle for the last decade about the stormwater fees, and they're not wrong because they're ungodly in comparison to most cities. Folks are going to lose their minds if we make this harder than it is already. And we also just made it more expensive, right? Last month, 2 months ago, the stormwater rates went up 3 months ago, $3 or whatever it is. Not much, but they just did. And I know that there's a scale and a cycle. I know that they even out over time, but people don't care about that. They just don't.
And I think the other side to that too is if we have to do it all as a municipality at the
Yep.
macro level, those rates are going to go up even more than if we ask development to do their portion
And that's
of it
where
as
my
well.
concern is though, James. That's where it's a horse apiece, because if we don't grow, it all gets more expensive anyway.
I agree with that.
It's a cart and a horse.
I think seeing how the big developments we have underway today would score
This will help, and that was a good question.
will really inform if we're even comfortable with scenario 3, which I think is just the next level up from where we are now, based on the scenarios you all provided.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so certainly we looked at a very limited supply of scenarios just because, again, we didn't want to ask them to do dozens and dozens because like Chuck said, we could spend, 3 years looking at that and never get anywhere. So we got to, try to pare that back. But certainly we can take a look at some of these other, bigger scale projects that are going on right now. You mentioned the Lake Edenmore Drive project. You mentioned the Mill on Main project. We can look at some other ones and try to see what.
James, if we move back one step in the conversation, if we doing this, why so what I'm doing here is back to the first question I asked. And I'm not trying to be the guy who doesn't care about the quality of the water, because I do. But if there's no prescribed methodology or no prescribed numbers that we have to meet, what inherently drives the cost higher when we already have the highest stormwater rates if we don't change these things, we don't move from one comma to the next?
Because
That's the-
we're going to have to make progress. We don't know what that progress,
I
what
get
what
that,
that
but
requirement is going to be.
I'm-
But, as Chuck said, in some of the past permits, they've said, you've got to make this increment each permit term.
Sure.
So.
Well, they want you to. They don't say you have to.
Well, it actually does say you have to.
But there's no recourse if you don't.
Certainly
And I'm not-
there is. There's enforcement action.
But there hasn't been, and there might be. But I don't want to argue with you about that point. I'm desperately concerned that the evaluation from me, who has a parking lot, is going to be, I already pay the highest rate in the state. Why am I now held to a higher standard than people down the road? That's really concerning to me, because that means people will choose to not build things here. And that makes everything more expensive.
But I think, if you look at the scenarios that we're kind of settling on, we're still lower than everybody else that, Chuck had analyzed.
Yeah, if you go back to that,
Across the
like Appleton and,
the actual numeric values are less than some of the surrounding areas.
I think
I get that.
Chris's point's a good one, though.
Yeah.
I think in terms of the communication here, we have to explain both. And if we can't
Correct.
explain both, we have a problem. Why are our rates what they are, and we have to implement these new requirements? And I understand that they are related but different.
Yep.
And I think we should be able to explain both.
Yeah.
Did I capture that right?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And I mean, everybody sort of knows why they're related. There's water everywhere. We get that that's hard, but we can't, that's a positive and not a negative. And until we find a way to collectively make that positive valuable and not more expensive, no one will care.
Yeah.
That's the hardest part. And I'm not saying you're wrong. All of this is correct, and I appreciate it all
Sure,
very much.
yeah.
But I have to look at it from the perspective of,
Yep.
because I want, not to be Paul Esslinger for a second, but I want property taxes to go down. If there's no new development here because it's more expensive to build things here than it is elsewhere, property taxes will not go down. They will continue to go up. And we have the highest rate of those anywhere near here also. So it's just tough to look at these types of things without there being anybody saying you have to do it, even though we should do it. And even though in the broad scheme of things, it might be cheaper to do it this way, that's not how it translates.
Agreed. I support all of this. I would love to get to the 90% number. Love it.
Same.
I think that there's a balance, and that's what we're dealing with.
Yep. That's why it's going to be hard.
Yeah. Well, if we don't get done through this process, we'll have to pick up the tab in the future. So that's the challenge.
We're having trouble paying it now, and so that's the
That's what I'm
that's the
getting
issue.
at.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is super helpful, though. I
Yeah.
definitely understand this a lot better than I did 2 hours ago.
Absolutely.
Good.
And that was, the biggest point is, we haven't had conversations with the council about, stormwater as a whole in quite some time. And something like this is very,
Technical.
yes, thank you, technical and challenging. It's hard for us sometimes to wrap our brains around what the DNR and the EP are telling us we have to do.
Yeah.
And if we can't do it, how can we bring something to you that you can understand as well?
And more importantly, how can the developers that want to build here understand it?
Right.
Right.
And so that, yeah.
You've done a great job
Yeah,
of breaking
absolutely.
it
Yeah.
down.
Yep.
We went through a lot.
Right,
You guys had conversations.
Yeah, right. We took us a while to get here, but I appreciate your time listening. And certainly, if you have other questions, don't hesitate to ask and look at those couple of developments that are going on. And I appreciate the question.
Yeah.
That would help a ton. I agree.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Anything else for tonight?
think
All
so.
right, well,
Thank you.
thank you for the
Appreciate your
time.
time.
You know,
Thank you,
it's-
guys.
Thank
You know, as we certainly want to take advantage of a fifth Tuesday because we knew this wasn't going to be a 30 or 40-minute conversation. And we also knew that, if we tried to gamble on an after-meeting agenda, we'd have to try to make sure we found a light one. And, every time I think we're there, I guess wrong. So while it was a little bit, quick, I certainly think this worked out better because we could give it the time it
Yeah,
needed.
this is great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh,
Thank
thanks
you
for
all.
coming. Yeah, appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right.